to talk a little bit about your business, the Table Group, and what you guys do. So just give us an overview of your mission and the day-to-day monthly duties and what you guys are so passionate about and what you're doing with the business community.
Sure, Ken. The Table Group, we started about 10 years ago, and the underlying purpose, one that you won't find on our website, was to make work more fulfilling for people and to make organizations healthier. But the way we did that is we started working with CEOs to try to make their organizations more effective. But the underlying reason was we thought work should be a fulfilling and productive place for human beings to be.
Yeah, and so you guys do a ton of consulting as well as what are some of the other services you provide?
Yeah, we've shifted. We do a lot of consulting, and we were originally just a consulting firm, but now in addition to the writing of books and articles, we've developed products around teams and around the Miserable Job book to help people apply this stuff on their own team assessments. And then I do a lot of speaking. So between the products, the speeches, the consulting, and the network of consultants we've kind of certified around the country, we're kind of a full services, I don't know if you call it a think tank, or we just help organizations and leaders become more effective.
Exactly. And so I think it would be neat to hear how much of your time do you spend consulting versus, because you're a very popular speaker and of course you're writing, how much time do you spend on the ground, if you will, in some of the consulting that your company does?
Well, it's interesting. I've spent considerably less recently. We have another gentleman at our firm who is in charge of consulting, and we've certified these other people around the country, so I don't do a lot, although in fact, I do a lot more for my church and other churches. I do a lot of pro bono stuff, so I find that most of my consulting is now done with organizations where I have some sort of connection or a calling and where I don't really get paid. And that keeps me fresh. But most of my time, other than the pro bono stuff, is done writing, speaking, and then managing the firm.
Do you find a uniquely different experience in working with churches or nonprofits versus the many Fortune 500 and large companies you've worked with in the past?
Probably less of a difference than most people would think. But yes, some interesting differences around expectations of conflict and accountability. There's something very clarifying about the bottom line of an organization where people will be a little bit more comfortable confronting one another because the revenue is down. Whereas in a church, it's a little fuzzier and people feel like they have to be nicer, though that doesn't really always translate into kinder. So yeah, there's some differences, but fundamentally people are the same and the dynamics are largely similar.
Wow. So I have to ask this, and this may be a very broad question, and it puts you on the spot a bit, but I wonder, in the thousands of experiences that you've had consulting and working one-on-one or in small groups with these executive teams that you've worked with, has there been a few circumstances or situations, if you will, that really have astonished you, whether it be positive or negative? It was one of the things where it was like, wow, that was really, it was a surprise to you maybe in some of the information that you were given or in the exchange. Anything stick out to you?
I get a lot of positive ones that I really enjoy. And I remember one particular one was a faith-based organization, but not necessarily overtly so, and it wasn't a church. And there were these two gentlemen in there, and we were working with the team, and we were doing the Myers-Briggs and talking about how the organization interacts and the executive team interacts. And when these people realized that the things that they were each doing to annoy one another over the years, and what had caused them to have a strain in their relationship, was actually just the way God made them and the way they were wired from a Myers-Briggs standpoint, and to have them look at each other and say, I always thought you did that on purpose. And the other guy said, no, I just can't help it. And then the one guy said, well, I can help you with that. And he goes, I would love it if you would help me. When you see that, and you see two people that have kind of been at odds now actually volunteering to help one another, it is overwhelming every time, and that was probably one of the starkest examples.
Wow, so something so simple as the way we're hardwired, yet if you don't know it about the other person, it almost can be a personal rub.
Right. The prayer of St. Francis is seek to understand people before being understood. And once they tried to understand the other person, it all changed.
Oh, that's good. Well, I want to get to the new book. Late 2007, you released your latest book, The 3 Signs of a Miserable Job. And what I love about all your titles, they're very straightforward. And so that's, we know what this is about, obviously. But I wanted you to give the author's overview. Just give us an overview for those who've not yet picked the book up or read anything about it. What's the book about, obviously, there? And then again, tell us, after that, what was the inspiration for the book?
Right. Well, the book is another fiction story about that brings this theory to life. And essentially the premise is, or the theory is based on the fact that a bad job and a miserable job are not the same things. A bad job depends on the person you're talking to. It lies in the eye of the beholder. Some people don't like certain kinds of work. My job would be miserable to some people. Another person's job would be miserable to me. But a miserable job is universal because it's the kind of job that you dread going to and you come home more cynical and frustrated and have a harder time as a parent or a spouse or a neighbor. Job misery is universal, whether you're a professional football player, whether you're an executive, or whether you're a waitress. And so that's what the book is about. The genesis of it, or the inspiration, came from the time when I was a child. And my dad, who was very good at his job and was very successful, was always so frustrated by his management that he came home complaining almost every night. And I came to realize that it had a definite impact on him. And I remember, even as a child, thinking that is wrong. When a person has to leave their family for 8 or 9 or 10 hours a day, they at least deserve to come home feeling good about the contribution they're making and not frustrated by the people they work for. So when I got out of college and became a management consultant, I found that my heart was still there. And this book, more than anything I've ever done, is really the consummation of why we started the company.
Wow. So I got to ask, I mean, this is an obvious question, and you actually have some stats. You say that 77% of people dislike their jobs, and Gallup says that this miserable job epidemic, if you will, is costing employers more than $350 billion in lost productivity. So the question is, what is the real cause of all this misery?
Well, you know, and those stats come from various organizations, and it's hard to quantify. All I know is that it's massive. And what's causing it, I think, is a couple things. One, there's this belief in society. My dad used to say when I was a kid, you know, if it were fun, they wouldn't call it a job. And I think since World War II, and this probably goes back thousands of years, people have kind of equated working with misery or difficulty. And I think there's a paradigm that people have that it's a job and that's just the way it is. And I just fundamentally disagree with that. The other underlying cause is that managers do not understand that their jobs are a ministry. I mean, beyond the task they're responsible for, they have the responsibility to people that work for them to make them productive, to make them feel appreciated, and to help them elevate themselves in life. And when a manager who is beholden to the same problems that anybody else is loses sight of that, we create this cascading, spiraling situation where one miserable job begets another miserable job and so on.
Wow.
But then you go to Southwest Airlines or Chick-fil-A or companies like that, and you see spiraling, cascading job fulfillment, and you realize it does not have to be this way.
Absolutely. Well, and again, for those who haven't read the book yet, and I highly recommend that you go out and read it, but just unpack for us briefly the actual 3 signs and how you kind of define those signs. Okay,
well, the first sign of a miserable job, and these all seem very obvious, which is what makes it so surprising that we continue to experience them. The first sign of a miserable job is anonymity. When an employee feels like his or her manager doesn't know or care about or that they're interested in who they are as a human being, it is impossible for them to feel fulfilled in their work. Now, the reason why I feel so confident in that is because one of the examples I have of this is professional football players. I've seen professional athletes who, surprisingly, in spite of the money they make and the attention they get from the media and fans, feel miserable at work. I'd say most of them do. And in most cases, it's because their coaches see them as commodities. And they don't really take an interest. It's like in college coaches really get into their players because they see them as kids. And somehow a 19-year-old decides to go pro, or a guy turns 25 years old, and they think of them as people who don't need any care and feeding anymore. Now, whether you're a waitress or a professional football player or the head of marketing at a Fortune 500 company, if you don't think your manager really cares about you as a person, you can't love your work, because we all have a need to be known.
Wow, that's really good. I got to ask a follow-up on that, because you and I, several years ago, we had spent some time with John Maxwell, and I think it was before a dinner, and you were talking about how you had been studying leadership qualities of NFL coaches and kind of put a fun exercise together. But because I know you are an observer of sports and leadership, and you just mentioned this example, you've heard the reports about how the Giants and Tom Coughlin, he really changed his style. Are there other, and of course they had great results because he's known as a very hard kind of chafing coach. Are there really relational coaches that stick out to you, whether it be the NFL or other sports, that you could really say, Ken, I really believe it's because of this factor that you just mentioned, which is they show they care?
Yeah, I think that Dick Vermeil stands out more than any. And he's had great success. And he came back to coaching, I think, when he was in his late 60s or maybe even 70. And people said he'd been away for like 15 years. And they said, oh, he's been away from the game too long. But the thing is, when you work for Dick Vermeil, when you play for him, you play harder than you do for other coaches because this man takes a fundamental interest in you, and his wife does. And when he cuts a player and tears are rolling down his cheeks, it's not fake. And players will walk through walls of fire for him. And oftentimes you see when he leaves an organization, people think, well, they're going to be really good next year. And their performance, as the Chiefs have, deteriorates. And oftentimes that's because people don't understand how much motivation players get from knowing that the guy they work for cares so much about them.
Well, I think that is so deep. Well, let me get to the second sign, which is irrelevance.
Yes. And this is my favorite one to talk about and to think about, I think, because if people don't think that their job matters to someone in some way, large or small, they can't love their work. And you think immediately of teachers and nurses and doctors and ministers and priests. Of course, their jobs have more obvious connections to how they help people. And yet what's interesting, a lot of teachers and nurses and priests and ministers and doctors are not happy because they're not being reminded of how critical that is. They go to orientation or they go to nursing school and they think they want to change the world, but then no manager on a day-to-day basis is reminding them how important their job is to others. Well, if those people can lose sight of that, you can just imagine what a waiter or a midline manager or an IT specialist at a company, they're often left to wonder, does my job matter to anyone in the world? The truth is, everybody's job does. It just depends on how you see it, and it might be a coworker, it might be a vendor, it might very well be just your manager that you're really making a difference. But everybody deserves to have that made clear and to be reminded of why their job matters. And if there's a job out there in the world that does not really make a difference in anyone else's life, then we should probably build a computer to do that.
Yeah, wow.
But everybody, and I talk to people, and I think they just don't get in touch with why their job matters. The guy at the fast food counter at a restaurant, if he can give a person a glimmer of compassion and joy in the moment, that's going to have a difference on that person's day. But too many managers are just take their money. I was a bank teller, and they just cared if I was 3 cents out of balance at the end of the day. They don't care if my customers love me, if I made my colleagues happy. If I was 3 pennies out of balance, I was failing.
Yeah.
So
that's so true. And the third sign is what you label immeasurement.
Yeah, which is not a word in the dictionary because we couldn't figure out a word. Immeasurement is the inability of a person to measure or assess for themselves whether they're being successful, primarily in how they impact others. And so if I go to work and I have no observable, objective ways to say I had a good day or I've had a good week, and I have to depend on just my manager to say, yeah, I think you've done a good job, I feel a lack of control. I feel completely dependent upon that other person. And it's really difficult, if not impossible, for a person to love their work if their success depends on the mood of their manager, because then you would find yourself, being political. This is why waiters and waitresses and salespeople protect their quota and their tips so much, because it gives them, they're not coin-operated. Everybody thinks they just like to do things for money. But they want to know objectively how they're doing. And a salesperson loves to know if they're making their numbers the same way an athlete likes to see the score on the scoreboard and know what their statistics are. It's an objective way for them to assess for themselves if they're succeeding.
Mm. And Pat, when I look at this sign of immeasurement, I start to think instinctively of the CEO, the very top leader, because all of these signs and the premise of the whole book, and you state very clearly that, look, this is up to the manager to encourage people and help make the people that are under them make their jobs not miserable by applying all these rules. So I wonder, you've worked with so many CEOs, and we have a lot of leaders listening that are maybe senior pastors or even business people that are at the very top, and that can be a lonely spot.
Absolutely.
How do you address the misery given the information we've just been talking about, when maybe there's not somebody above them to give them an attaboy? How does that top leader, who has no peer, if you will, in the organization, is it just the third sign?
You know, it's a great question, Ken. It's one of the reasons why I think being a CEO, in spite of everybody saying, oh, they're lucky, they make a lot of money, they have all these perks, it is one of the loneliest, most difficult jobs there is. And in many cases, it's kind of thankless.
Mm-hmm.
And some people will say, well, you need to get that from your board of directors. But that doesn't really work that way because, one, it's not the job of the CEO to please the board of directors. It's the job of the CEO to produce the kind of results that are necessary. And so what my advice to CEOs is if you don't have a spouse that knows what you're doing and can at least share in your success, it's very difficult. Secondly, you have to, in some ways, turn to the people you manage, and it's a delicate, difficult situation to get some of that confirmation that you're headed in the right direction. More importantly, if you're not extra strong and have a lot of self-esteem and can take it away from just seeing the results of the company, if you need a lot more strokes than that, it's going to be tough to be happy in that role, which is why people that are great CEOs are often some of the most humble, hardworking, and self-determined people, and it's a trait I really admire.
So does that play into then what Jim Collins' research showed, that level 5 leader that's less of a, I don't want to use the word ego maniac or megalomaniac? Is that why that person is much more successful in that role if they are humble, like you're saying?
Absolutely. What they want more than anything is just the knowledge that they're doing good and making an impact, and they don't necessarily need to be recognized for it. And yes, it's all about level 5 leadership. You have to care about producing results, but it's not about the attention you get, which is why people look to the world of politics for great examples of leadership, and I think it's harder and harder to find leaders in the world of politics. In fact, I have a hard time identifying any who I think are truly great leaders because most of them are addicted to attention.
Right. Well, we're going to talk about that a little bit later, so if you're listening to this, hang on because you're going to get some great insight from Pat. I want to move to, and by the way, that's just great stuff, Pat, and again, it just really magnifies the loneliness of leadership and how important it is to practice the things you just gave us. That was really good stuff. I want to switch gears to an article in preparing for this interview, just kind of dinking around on your website and looking around, and I saw a great article, really a point of view that you have on your website about a thing you call the law of thirds, and I think it's very, very practical. Can you unpack what do you mean by the law of thirds?
Yeah, and I don't know where I learned about this or heard about this, and it's such a simple concept that's never been attributed to anyone that I've seen. The law of thirds is just, when you're a leader, essentially you can break down the constituents you lead into thirds. There are supporters, people that generally want the right thing and are going to be supportive of most of what you do. There's the undecideds who are just not sure if what you're doing is right or not, and they're not going to weigh in one way or the other. And then there's the naysayers who are going to criticize almost all the time. And whether you're leading a company and these are your employees, or whether you're a principal and these are the parents, or your customer base, you can really break down this into thirds. Now, I don't think it breaks down necessarily into 33%, 33%, 33%. I think it's really 3 different sections. And imagine it like the flag of France, 3 sections across. Well, there's a fundamental decision that leaders have to make, and it's so critical. And every time I share this with leaders, they think they just really resonate with it. And that is, you can choose to manage with a focus on your supporters. In other words, you can go into it and assume, listen, I've got to manage this company as though I had a group full of supporters around me. And if you do that with that kind of mindset, what happens is the naysayers, the undecideds actually shift over into the supporter third, because they're like, it looks like this is the right way to go. And if this person's confident like that, it's time for me to be supportive. In the naysayer group, half of those people will leave the organization. The other half will actually say, I'm tired of being in this side of it. I'm going to become a supporter too. And so this is a great way to help people select out of an organization when they're just always complaining. And so I find that it can be 5 or 10% in the naysayer quadrant, and yet to a leader it feels like it's 50 because they are so noisy, and they have a way of making themselves look bigger than they are. So if you choose to manage toward the supporters, you end up creating a greater base. Now, if you're like many of us are, and I have to say I'm very, very susceptible to this, and you manage toward the naysayers, you just want to convince them. You think, if I could only convince those people that are complaining, wouldn't things be great? First of all, they almost never change. Secondly, the undecided say, well, that's how to get attention around here. I'm going to be a naysayer too. Finally, and probably most compellingly, half of your supporters will leave. The top half will say, I don't want to work someplace where supporting the way to get this done means I'm going to not get attention. The other half of the supporters decide that they're going to complain too.
Wow.
And it's so, if you're a minister or a priest in a church and you're like got these 5 people that are always complaining and you spend a lot of time trying to win them over, all you're doing is alienating those people. That is probably 50% of the church that just is going to support doing the right thing.
So the most effective way, obviously, is to try to say, hey, just rally your base and deal as effectively as you can with the naysayers.
It's not about ignoring them. It's just about not feeding them and not messaging toward them.
Right. That's good. I want to ask a question specifically because you're active in your church and you work with a lot of ministries and churches, and so you know that these leaders have to deal primarily with a lot of volunteers, especially in your larger ministries and even in small ministries, to get things done. And that has its own unique challenges. Speaking to these leaders who have to deal with volunteers, what are a couple of insights or maybe some very important things you say, you know what, if you just did this, these 2 or 3 things I think will allow you to be a more effective leader in dealing with volunteers?
Yeah, I think the most important thing, there's 2 thoughts I have. First of all, and I don't know who wrote this, but I love it, we should think about all of our employees as volunteers, whether we're paying them or not. Essentially, we still have to solicit their buy-in and their passion around things. So maybe one of the things we have to do is, instead of focusing on how to manage volunteers, is we have to realize that anyone who works for us is essentially volunteering. Some of them just get a check for it. But the other thing I would say is this. The temptation of managing volunteers is that we should lower our standards for them and not hold them accountable to the same levels of quality or success that we do for people we pay. The problem with that is that ultimately, not unlike the last conversation we had, drives away your best volunteers who want more than anything to be excellent. I worked at the Make-A-Wish Foundation for 3 years as on the board of directors. And one of the things about the Make-A-Wish Foundation, because it's a great organization and they're dealing with kids with life-threatening illnesses, they have no tolerance for dropping the ball when you're a volunteer and dealing with these families and these kids. As a result of that, people are desperate to be a volunteer at the Make-A-Wish Foundation because it ennobles them and raises them up, and it makes them feel like they're doing something good. And a lot of churches are this way, say, these people don't show up sometimes, and we should just let them do it their way, and if it's not that great, we can't really hold them accountable because they might quit. All you do is drive away the best volunteers and make it easy for the poor ones to stay.
That's so true, because the folks who want to excel want standards. They want to see achievement. They want to see something happen.
Yeah, and when they look from one side to the other and they see people not being held to high standards, they just go, gosh, I got to find an organization where people are meeting my levels of concern.
No, that's really good. Well, I want to ask you a question, because you and your message and your work have really reached a critical mass where you've become an influencer of leaders, a thought leader. You speak all over the country, large audiences. You're an author. So one of the things I want to ask you is, what is one of your great challenges? Because you are also leading an organization and a team, but yet you are also looked to by many very effective and impressive leaders to challenge them and make them better. So what do you find is something you really are challenged by in the role that you fulfill?
Well, the hard part of that is answering in the role that I fulfill. What challenges me in general is, one, I feel like I have to please everyone, and that's the recipe for disaster. I was just talking to my wife about that today. Secondly, I'm extremely impatient. And then, like so many people, the pleasing part, I don't like to hold people accountable that I work with because I want them to like me, and which is a terrible thing for them and for me. That's not like a nice problem to have. It's a bad thing. And then, like everybody else, I have insecurities at times. We all do. In terms of my role as consulting to people and giving them advice, it's probably that having to confront them. I was at a church meeting last night, I'll just tell you this, and I had to stop the meeting and really challenge these people because I thought they weren't stepping up. They weren't holding themselves accountable to making a difficult decision that would help the church and help bring people closer to God. And I had to say, this is exactly the kind of thing that will not work. And they did not want to hear it. Some of them were not particularly happy that I reminded them of that. And I came home and said to my wife, Laura, I think I did what God called me to do, and I feel like some people are mad at me for that. I struggle with that hard because my personality type is that I want people to like me. And that's not a good quality to have if you're a leader. There's times when you have to do what's right, even when people reject you.
Yeah, that's tough. Well, I want to shift gears and keep moving more personal because we like to ask the leaders that we get to talk to questions and get to know them better and therefore learn from them. And so I always love to ask this question. Who, Pat, has influenced you? That could be anything from family members to leaders from history or authors, but who are some of the people that have had tremendous influence on you and thus your success?
You know, I feel like such a loser when people ask me this question, and I don't know if I'm not introspective enough, but I should have a really great answer. I mean, as a Christian, and it's not disingenuous or silly to say this, but I mean, Christ himself, I mean, I've never spent more time praying to and reading about and thinking about, I think, anybody than Jesus Christ. So certainly he's at the top of the list. Then throughout my life, I had a track coach and a cross-country coach in high school who took an interest in me and really inspired me to reach higher in my life, and he who died just while I was in high school, and so I think he's had a particularly important impact because it got kind of frozen in time there. And then in other areas of life, it's occasional friends and people I've met. There's a gentleman named Matthew Kelly who's a writer and an author who inspires me in his writing, and he and I have become friends. There's a few priests that I've met and other folks. So I wish I could say there's this one single person. And certainly my parents have had a profound impact on me. But I guess I would say it's that coach I had and then a number of clergy members. And Ken Blanchard is a person who's inspired me a great deal. Ken is one of the most egoless people I've ever met. And he and another guy wrote and because I'm sitting here on the phone, Hodges is his name, Phil Hodges, and they wrote the book Lead Like Jesus. And Phil and Ken just knock me out in terms of their no ego commitment to helping people and doing what's right. So
I've been
a
reading
list of people.
Yeah.
Ken Blanchard, Phil Hodges, Matthew Kelly, Joel Mena, my coach in high school, and of course wrapping it all up in Christ.
Yeah, I love that. And again, there's no perfect answer. I mean, we just wanted to hear what has influenced you. And I want to ask a follow-up because I've been reading a book called The Game Still Counts by a Fox News contributor, and he interviewed literally, tens and tens of some big name leaders who've been very successful. And it was all about how their life had been influenced by childhood sports or adolescent sports. And the fact that you mentioned that coach, beyond the coach itself, how much did youth and adolescent sports teach you just about life? Because I'm assuming because of his role, that there were some significant moments there. And I'd like to ask that question of successful leaders as well. What kind of role did it play?
Oh, well, I was a sports nut as a kid, and I played football and basketball and baseball, and I ran track and cross country, and I played soccer a little bit as a kid. And it had a huge role, not always positive. I mean, you see some bad things out there, too, and it teaches you lessons.
Sure.
But you learn how to lose, and you learn how to win. You learn that that's not what's most important, but how you play. But it teaches you how to be self-reliant. It teaches you how to look out for a teammate. I had a coach when I was 12 years old tell me I had to bean a kid on the other team to throw the ball at him as I was a pitcher. And I stood there on the mound and I refused. And he said, "No, I want you to do it." And I said, "No." And he walked off the mound mad at me.
Yeah.
And then I had other coaches my dad coached me in a lot of sports, was wonderful and patient, and I had others that took it. So I think youth sports is great. And I'll tell you, as a parent of 9-year-old boys and a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, we're losing our way because too much youth sports today is about preparing them to try to get a Division I scholarship when they are 8 years old.
Right.
And I coach youth soccer and basketball and baseball now for the very reason that I want to teach these kids life lessons and teach them that winning is not incongruent with those life lessons, but winning is not the ultimate goal.
Right.
And it is a challenge, and people that are listening to this know their kids are in sports, and there are full-time trainers and coaches that think their job is to get our kids to the Olympics.
Right.
When we want them to just grow up to be great kids.
And I have to ask this question, and you'll know a little bit about me when I ask it immediately. But while we need to chill out on, the activities of these kids in general, not just sports, my question is, one thing that irritated me in college, Pat, is I remember going to coach a 5- and 6-year-old soccer team at the YMCA.
Yep.
And they told me at my coaches meeting that in this age group, the 5- and 6-year-olds, we're not going to keep score. So please don't tell the score to your kids. We're not going to keep score. But in the 7- and 8-year-old league, they began to keep score. That always irritated me because while I agree with what you said, that it's not just about winning because you are going to lose in life and you need to learn how to handle that. I never understood why it's okay to keep score for 7- and 8-year-olds, but not 5- and 6-year-olds. And the general question I have for you is shouldn't we, at even the youngest ages, begin teaching that there is a score and that there's sometimes you don't win, but you need to learn how to walk off with your chin up and you played well, so therefore your day's not ruined. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, absolutely. I think that especially the question is, when they start being aware of the score, you better keep it. Now, there are these leagues where the kids are just too young to even pay attention to it, and there's nothing wrong with that. But when we think we're protecting them from consequences by doing that or not giving them grades, there's even colleges where you don't get grades. And it's like, life is eventually going to come to you, and you're going to have to be responsible and accountable. And I think what we should do is give them the score, but teach them that their self-esteem shouldn't rise and fall with that.
Right.
As
Okay.
opposed to not giving it to them
Sure.
and protecting them from any sense of responsibility. I don't know. I'm not a child psychologist, but there was an age where I was still coaching sports and we weren't keeping score because the league didn't keep score, but the kids did.
Yeah.
And then they would argue afterward about what the real score would have been.
Yeah, right.
I think we had probably gone long past time where it's fine to keep score.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I must tell you, I rebelled and told my kids. But I held their chins up when they lost, but I just couldn't buy into that. Well, enough of that. But let me move into another question, which is your personal opinion on leaders, past or present, that you just really admire. I thought you said something interesting earlier, and we're going to get to this political question here very shortly. But you said, I don't find a lot of leaders that I find to be great leaders in the current political scene because of the attention issue. So when you look at the past or, again, the present landscape, who are some leaders you don't mind sharing with us that, hey, I really admire them, and here's why?
So if I went into the world of politics, I would say, and this sounds so simple, but George Washington was an amazing man, and in these past few years we've learned more and more about him.
Right.
The selflessness of the things he did and how he gave up power. And somebody once quoted that King George, I guess it was, I'm sure that was who, when Washington was actually encouraged to become essentially the king of the United States after they won the war, King George in England, I think it was King George, said, if he turns this down, he's the greatest leader of all time.
Right.
And he did, because he was not an ego guy. Lincoln was miserably hated during much of his presidency. And so I have great admiration for him for sticking to his guns even when he wasn't popular. Theodore Roosevelt, I think, was, from what I've read, was a guy who was principled beyond public opinion. And then it starts to get harder as the media has become more and more important. We've had a harder and harder time. When Reagan died, everybody said he was such a great president. But let me tell you, they hated him when he was president. I had really admired that he never wavered. Pope John Paul II was a similar guy. When they finally die, people say, whoa, he was a wonderful pope and a wonderful leader. The media hated these guys.
Right.
And, of course, when they die, they want to change the story. But when people can stand up in the face of opposition and stick to their principles, I admire them greatly. And I'm looking every year, whenever there's an election, for someone who can do that. And I will say something at the risk of being totally unpopular, whether I agree with everything he's done or not, and I don't, but George W. Bush I've found not to be a kind of guy that really is wavering with public opinion. Now, I don't agree with everything he does, but I don't think that he thinks his job is to be popular.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Now, in this new election coming up, I'm struggling because the three remaining candidates all seem to be very concerned with being well-liked and popular. But I love what Jim Collins says. You can be a charismatic person and still be a great leader as long as you know what a challenge it is to overcome.
Right.
I'm worried about people that are mostly about charisma, not about experience or clear sets of beliefs.